So the title of this chapter was Every Trip is a Quest. And Foster started off this chapter with an example. And just a brief overview of it, it was a 16-year-old kid named Kip. He was on his way to the A&P, which is a store, and he was riding his bike and he was going to run errands for his mother. And along the way, he had a couple of disturbing experiences. He had an encounter with the German Shepherd, and then another one with one of his enemies and the girl of his dreams named Karen, who was hanging out with Tony, who was the one she didn't like. And basically, Kid never liked Tony because he had a rich, fancy last name, and it wasn't ordinary like Smith. And also because he never has to work a day in his life because of how much money him and his family had. So he goes into the store and he decided to go ahead and get the loaf of bread for his mother. And when he was reaching for the bread, he just decided to go to the Marine recruiter and lie about his age so he can get recruited and have a possibility of going to Vietnam. Because in the city that he lived in, nothing really mattered unless how much money you had. So, surface versus deeper reading. When using surface reading in literature, we use the text literally to come up with the concept or theme. So, using the text basic facts and not really reading deeper into it. And because of that, with the previous example, we just assumed that it was a story about a boy who took a trip to the store just for bread because his mother wanted bread. But when we did deeper reading or reading structurally, we understand that the story was really about a knight and an unfriendly encounter with his enemy. And this is because we didn't really use the basic story's facts and take everything literally. We went deeper into the fact and looked at main concepts of how we can connect it. So, quest narrative. When reading literature, a lot of times we can say that there's a quest or a task to be completed, and at the end we see the real reason why the quest had to be completed. And just elements of the quest, of any quest, not just the example that we read, but there has to be a quester, a place to go, a stated reason to go, so such as Kip having to go get bread from the A&P. Challenges was the German Shepherd and his enemy Tony. And then the real reason to go, which was to understand himself and realize that he wanted to go to the Marines. And a lot of times also self-knowledge. So application, just really how to read structurally. You have to take a step back beyond the story's basic facts and view it analytically. So mainly reading between the lines. Don't take words so seriously in literature. So words such as always and never, don't think that has such a strong meaning in the text. Don't try to understand the right and wrong ways of literature. So don't think because one author, they write literature one way that it has to be the same all around. And lastly, interpret the passage and make connections to make what you read enjoyable.
Chapter 2 Acts of Communion in Literature. What is communion? Literary versions of communion can interpret the word in quite a variety of ways. In literature, communion is a coming together or a shared experience between the characters, sharing in peace, and it's not always holy, unlike Christianity. Why? If the author is going to include people eating together, there's probably a reason. Things are not what they seem in literature. It's usually a symbol for something deeper. Communion indicates relationship between characters. The chapter explained how eating is a form of communion and how it is symbolic. A meal gone good was a strong relationship. A meal gone wrong foreshadows future problems. Everyone attending a meal has one thing in common, which is death. Examples: Dinner at Homesick Restaurant by Ann Tyler in 1982 was when a mother tries to get her family together multiple times, but there's always a complication, and finally when the mom dies, they finally come together. A second example is Henry Fielding's Tom Jones in 1749. He used the characters eating to represent a sex scene that cannot be in a movie, so he used very descriptive words and used the characters' interactions to represent that. And the third one's the cathedral. And for the assignment, you're going to read the summary below of the cathedral and write down how this is a communion. And then for your application, have you ever been involved in a communion? How did it end, positively or negatively?
This is my presentation. It's about chapter 3 of the How to Read Literature Like a Professor. It is called Nice to Eat You. This chapter shows literal vampirism. The definition of vampirism is the act of being a vampire. Some authors use this term in their work literally. Typically, most books use vampire to gain life through other victims and such things as sucking blood from young people. In most books, a vampire can be described as a terrible, nasty old man, but sometimes can be viewed as an attractive person. They usually violate young women and take their innocence, and that's what they're known for in the literal version. The sexual aspects of vampirism, as told in chapter 3, in typically the mid 19th century, it was socially unacceptable for any author to write directly about sex or any sexual topics or issues. The many of the authors incorporated vampires into the story to convey sexual messages, since it wasn't socially acceptable to write about them directly. Like Dracula shows body shame, unwholesome lust, temptations, and a major lack of respect. They also use symbolic vampirism. This is the most common occurrence in the literature. One symbolic reference is like when a character drains the life out of another character, not literally, but mentally. And this chapter's importance is to show how vampirism was used in many of the author's works, and it shows how the authors used things even though when it was socially not acceptable um, in this time period. And then this is my assignment. All you have to do is find out if this is literal or symbolic, and you write the answer below.
All right, so I had chapter 5, and it's essentially about the connections between stories, okay? So, writers, pretty much all writers, use bits and pieces of their past in their writing and other literature and types of entertainment they make. They use things from other books, movies, songs, historical events, anything like that, any sort of past personal experience, even. Um, you may notice that things are being used from other sources, like character archetypes, maybe an event. Stuff kind of follows the same type of plot line, etc., etc. So, for example, in Going After Casciato by Tim O'Brien, which is a book about a group of soldiers in the Vietnam War, one of their soldiers goes AWOL, and they essentially chase after him, try to track him down, bring him back. But they fall into a hole on the road, and they fall down this hole into these tunnels, kind of like in Alice in Wonderland, how she kind of falls down the rabbit hole and whatnot. And they get down there, and the tunnels underground are very much like the surreal world that Alice finds herself in. So he pulled from Alice in Wonderland in that aspect, but he also pulled from his history and historical characters, and or not characters, but figures like Sacagawea, when a foreign woman helped guide the soldiers through the tunnels. So essentially, all stories are connected. You know, everything's connected. Everybody uses elements of their past in their writing, and this actually connects all stories together as sort of one story where they're all pulling from each other. So newer stories are pulling from older stories, and you can see the connections between them. It's kind of like a barrel of eels was the analogy that the book used, where it's a huge mass of eels, and even if one new one is born, it's a separate eel, but it kind of has the same genetics and the same background as all the other eels. So it's kind of like the stories are different stories, they're their own story, but they're connected in a way.
So I had chapter 6, and it was called When in Doubt. It's from Shakespeare. This piece of text is describing mostly how William Shakespeare's work is known universally. It gives examples of how his work is incorporated into different musicals, plays, books, and movies. There's no versions and remakes of his work. It mostly dominates English literature in the 18th through 21st centuries, and it can be seen through a writer's voice, ideas, and reflected through language. There was a show in the 1970s that was a series of Shakespeare's work being remade and produced on television. John Cleese played a character in Shakespeare's Taming of the Shrew remake on the series, which was a comedy. Cole Porter produced music for the play Kiss Me, Kate in the late 1940s. This play and the music was based off of Shakespeare's work. Also, Taming of the Shrew. Shakespeare's work was also reflected in a novel in 1991 written by Jane Smiley. It was an allegory of Shakespeare's work. It was called A Thousand Acres. And the application question I have is, what are some of the themes represented in some of Shakespeare's work? There was a lot of different themes represented in the works over the years.
Chapter 7, or the Bible. In Chapter 7, or the Bible, it discusses how many different writers use some parts of the Bible to convey their message. Even if writers are not religious, they can still quote parts from the Bible. Thomas Foster talks about how many writers might only need a title, so a great place for them to look for that is the Bible. When writers quote words or phrases from the Bible, it is not always in a positive way. Sometimes it can be used in a negative way. So why do writers use this tactic? Some writers use the Bible to make a bigger emphasis on a story that they're trying to create. They try to make the story more intriguing and exciting. If writers cannot think of anything to write, then they probably search through the Bible to find something because that's easier. Some examples that were given is Thomas Foster references the James Dean film called East of Eden. That's because Eden refers to Genesis in the Bible. In the James Dean film, he used Eden to show how people outside of the Garden of Eden were fallen and were broken. Hemingway used the title The Sun Also Rises, which is from the book of Ecclesiastes in the Bible. So how can you analyze on your own? When reading, consider the impact of things that remind you of the Bible. If you're unfamiliar with the Bible, try to become more familiar with it so you can recognize different literary references as they occur throughout readings. When reading them, try to think about how that biblical basis relates to the meaning of the passage being looked over. The assignment: is there anything you have seen or heard that has a biblical meaning or background?
Chapter 8 is talking about whose works you can borrow from and who would be a good person to take ideas from as a writer to put into your writing. So the answer to this was Kitty Lit, for example, Alice in Wonderland, Narnia, Cat in the Hat, Sleeping Beauty, Rapunzel, because these are all stories we've heard for hundreds of years and they're stories that we are all very familiar with. So it also spoke about if you use references, for example, from the 80s and let's say it's a Ghostbusters movie. Will people 100 years from now understand it? Probably not. Then it goes on to talk about more traditional works, for example, Homer, Shakespeare, James Joyce. The question still being, who should you borrow from? And the thing is, not everybody knows these people, so they won't understand the references or where the ideas come from. So toward the middle of chapter 8, the question came up, that is, what can the writer use for analogies, preferences, plot structures that most of his readers will know? And we go back to Kitty Lit. And there's been one specific appeal in the late 20th century that's really been used repetitively, and it's children lost and far from home, for example, Hansel and Gretel. So to put it into more modern terms, let's say the two children are two young lovers. They wandered into the woods, and let's say the two young lovers' BMW broke down. The kids end up at a witch's house, and the young lovers end up at a crack house or some kind of haunted cabin in the woods. And then it goes on to talk about more in-depth examples of how this is being used. Then it goes to talk about irony, and it said, irony is a good way to show fiction and poetry. For example, Let's go back to the two lost lovers. Now, they don't know this part of town. So the things that make them feel powerful, like their BMW, their Rolex, their money, and their expensive clothes, don't help them at all. In fact, in this situation, makes them more vulnerable and exposed, just like the two kids were. So then it talks about us as readers, that we claim to want something strange and new and something like we've never read before, but we also want it to be familiar so that we can make some kind of sense of it. So, for example, harmonies to go with the melody of the storyline is what it said in chapter 8.
How to read literature like a professor. Chapter 9, It's Greek to Me. The main idea is about myths, and a myth is the shaping of a story and a symbol. These are ideas that are established in our minds that affect our culture and life, and they can also be valuable tales. The three main types of myths that we are most familiar with are biblical, folk and fairy tale, and Shakespearean. And out of these three, biblical myths are the most common because they cover the greatest range of human life and situations. Summary. It explains the background, culture, and ourselves. Writers use myth ideas in their writings because it is well known by readers and other authors. Understanding the story means you will have a better interpretation of a myth and the real reason that a myth is in a story. And most stories with conflict originate with some sort of flaw that happens in myths, so that's why they are referenced a lot more. How to use this tactic to analyze your own reading. Many authors like to put myths into their writings to give the readers life advice. Within their writing, they show myths through the characters and their behavior throughout the story. By having a myth in a story, we have the ability to explain ourselves to ourselves. Myths are also a way to appeal to most readers in a unique fashion. These are examples. The Icarus, which is a Greek myth, and it relates to current situations that are occurring today and just like life things that happen. And then the Iliad and the Odyssey is stories written by Homer, and he writes poems and stories, but in all of his types of work, he writes about basic instincts of humans. All the characters in his writings have these instincts within a story, and they face inner struggles of the human. And some of the instincts that he has shown in some of his writings are protection of family, faithfulness, struggles of returning home, and maintaining dignity. This is the assignment.
How to Read Like a Professor, Chapter 10. Chapter 10 of How to Read Like a Professor is about the significance of rain and inclement weather in general. In many instances in literature, rain is seen as a cleansing agent. One example of this is Noah's Ark from the Bible. Another example is Song of Solomon by Toni Morrison. The rain symbolically washes away sin, bad feelings, or lies that are put on by a character. Rain creates misery. Rain is used by authors to add an element of misery and discomfort to their story. Thomas Hardy wrote The Three Strangers in 1883, and the setting was the typical dark and stormy night that has been seen in so many literary works to date. Rain restores life. In some literary works, rain is used to symbolically restore something to its original, more pristine state. The most common usage of this symbolism is found in the springtime, when the rain comes and brings the viridescent glow of life back to the landscape. Assignment. Answer these questions on a separate sheet of paper. True or false? Rain is often used in literature to foster feelings of happiness and warmth. True or false? Rain is used to clean characters or a setting of sin. Write one example of rain being used to clean.
Chapter 11. Why would they use this tactic in their writing? Death is something everyone can relate to. Everyone has someone close to them die, and so when someone talks about death in a story, it creates a connection. When people are reading books, they get attached to certain characters, mainly main characters that appear a lot. And sometimes authors will kill those characters to mess with the reader's emotions and build their attachment to the book and excitement of what is going to happen next. How to use this tactic to analyze your own reading. As I talk about in my last slide, many authors like to use death in their writing to give the reader a reason to keep reading. In almost every single type of writing, whether it be nonfiction, fiction, mystery, or any other genre, usually one or more character dies. So when you're reading your next passage or book, take a minute to think about what role that character played in the book and why it is significant that that character was removed from the story. Maybe you could even think deeper into how the character died and how it affects all of the other characters that were close to that person. Examples: books with main character deaths: The Fault in Our Stars, Romeo and Juliet, A Thousand Boy Kisses, Before I Fall. Books with main characters that have disabilities: Carry the Ocean, The War That Saves, My Life Far From You, The Year We Fell Down. Assignment: think of a reading that you read in the past that has a significant death in it.
So I had chapter 12 and it was all about symbols. So the basic of symbols. So the main problem with symbols is that people always expect them to mean something when that's not always the case. And even when they do mean something, symbols cannot be reduced to standing for only one thing. And this is because if symbols only had one meaning, then it would limit the range of possible interpretations. So another problem is that many readers expect symbols to be objects and images rather than events or actions. However, actions can be symbolic as well. So when figuring out symbols, you have a couple tools. This can include questions, experience, or pre-existing knowledge. When figuring out what a symbol means, readers are going to bring a bunch of different things to the table because they all have their own history. So this can include things like previous readings, educational attainment, gender, race, class, faith, or social involvement. And then in conclusion, you really just want to listen to your instincts, pay attention to what you feel about the text, and then use these steps to help you when it comes to symbols. So you want to ask yourself, what is a symbol? How do you know? Which means, like, what is the evidence? And then why is that important?
Chapter 13, It's All Political. The chapter, It's All Political, describes how many authors are influenced to write stories due to the political and social climate around them. The chapter uses examples such as Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol and Edgar Allan Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher, to show how an author will put their input on social and political topics but using their ability to write to disguise their opinion. However, these authors have left clues for us sprinkled throughout their work, which allows us to see their true opinion about certain subjects. This is a great example on how analyzing a person's work can provide you with a new understanding and why it's important. Here are the hidden messages and why. There are many hidden messages throughout these authors' works, such as Charles Dickens when he talks about starving children in England, Rip Van Winkle when he talks about American freedom, Edgar Allan Poe's The Usher, which he talks about a decaying city and how the future is very grim, and D.H. Lawrence's Individualism to America. Here's how to find these hidden opinions. Look for keywords that might reveal an author's opinion or tone about a subject. Research the time period around this story and author, and theorize with peers. And here's your assignments. Find and highlight specific phrases or words that might reveal the author's opinion or underlying message.
I had chapter 14, Yes, She's a Christ, figure 2. This is a summary of the chapter, which mainly focuses on Christianity and how it is found in or linked to some novels. Despite the religious diversity in our state, America mainly consists of a Christian culture, which isn't trying to say that everyone is Christian, but mainly that people know why the religion is called Christianity and that people can recognize the features that make Christ who he is. A lot of cultural artifacts have been influenced by Christianity on some level. Therefore, it is useful to have some basic knowledge of Christianity if you are studying Western European and American literature. It also mentioned that in order to read like a professor, you have to
To the marlin, and although the old fisherman manages to kill a few, the sharks eat the fish, leaving behind only its skeleton. After returning to the harbor, the old fisherman goes to his home to sleep. In the meantime, Others see the skeleton tied to his boat and are amazed. Manolin is relieved to find him alive because many people thought the old fisherman had died, and the two agree to go fishing together. This is my short assignment. What are some of the similarities between the novel The Old Man and the Sea and the stories of Jesus in the Bible?
I had Chapter 15, Flights of Fancy. Chapter 15 is centered around flight and how it's symbolized in different types of literature. It's a known fact that humans can't literally fly like birds and insects can, and if we see a person in the air, it's usually from flying on an airplane or jumping, but we can't physically fly like birds and insects can. And even though that's the case, we have fantasized about flying for thousands of years, even though traveling in the air is still relatively new. Night at the Circus by Angela Carter tells a story about a woman who feels trapped by her ability of flight because she has to perform for a circus. And even though flight represents freedom, she still feels imprisoned and trapped. And it's ironic because flight in literature is associated with freedom. Authors try to stray away from fictional characters having the ability to fly, mostly to try to be more realistic and have themes for the reader to relate and connect to. They use flight as a symbol of freedom in other ways other than a fictional character physically flying, such as bird imagery. A symbolic way that characters take flight is when the soul leaves the body and rises up to heaven when someone dies, but this is mostly just associated with Christianity. In literature, flight is symbolic and it's another way to represent freedom. So when you see a character flying or flight in a book, it's representative of freedom or the lack of freedom.
So I had chapter 16. It's titled All About Sex. English professors are seen as having dirty minds because they are able to understand the sexual intentions of the author. They blame this on Sigmund Freud, who published The Interpretation of Dreams in the 1900s. He was a psychoanalyst of the time. When he shared this research on the interpretation of dreams, he opened the public to the idea of the subconscious. So now everyday objects were being seen sexually by the average person. For example, tall buildings could now be interpreted as male sexuality, whereas before they would just be seen as tall buildings. So the 20th century writers were learning to put this sexual content in their writing, and readers were learning to pick up on the subtle cues of it. So everyone knows the term that sex sells, which is why it's in so many movies and publications. And it's true, but in publications and in movies, scenes can only show so much. This is especially true in the mid-1900s. In the 1941 film named Maltese Falcon, the act of sex is shown by the moving and blowing of curtains. Although producers were using symbolism to avoid getting denoted for obscenity, oftentimes the cover-up scenes were just as dirty. At the end of Hitchcock's North by Northwest, there was a scene where a man and a woman started kissing, and then the clip changed to a train entering a tunnel. The examples of this type of symbolism in movies and books can go on forever. However, the point is that good readers can understand the symbolism. Good readers can understand the differences from talking about a normal tall building and using the tall building to refer to male sexuality in a book or movie. To be able to fully understand the text, readers must be able to pick up on the small details. That's what's most important, usually in reading. So for the application part, I just want you to find an example of one movie or book that uses symbolism to show that the sexual content is present without explicitly saying it.
Chapter 17. The main idea is authors try to avoid writing about the act of sex itself. opportunity to the intruder so she doesn't get killed. Domination, taking control, rule, power. An example is a child being raped by her stepfather. He controls the girl.
I had chapter 18 if she comes up with baptism. The main idea of chapter 18 is about a situation happening to you and you coming out a different person and how situations can change how other people see/treat you after the situation. Also, some people see it as you are reborn after a situation that changes you. In chapter 18, it referenced Judas Guest, Ordinary People. It was about when two brothers were sailing on Lake Michigan during a storm and one of them drowns and one of them survives. The brother that survives in everyone else's eyes should have been the one to die. Everyone looked down on him because they still continued to believe his brother should have lived and not him. Conrad, the brother that survived, was not the same after the boat accident. He even tried to kill himself because everyone was making him feel so bad about surviving. What's something that's happened in your life that caused you to come out a different person?
Chapter 19, Geography Matters. Geography in literature is more than just physical geography, such as mountains. Geography includes the current political and cultural environment, war or peace, or other conflict, physical geography, mountains, hills, etc., and the time period which the story takes place in. Geography could represent an overall deeper meaning of the story. Examples, if it's the story set in a snowy climate with thin air and it's set out in nature, it could carry a positive weight that could impact the story. If it is set in a crowded, dark area that's hot, it could carry a negative weight or just one of the above. Examples of geography in literature. In the book The Old Man by the Sea, which is set in Cuba, the relationship between Cuba and the U.S. geography is very important. The book is centered around Cuba's poverty due to its communist government at the time, the fishing culture, and the vibe the Cuban people had during the early 1950s. The book also touches on Cuba's love of baseball, American baseball. And for your assignment, think of a book or movie or TV show and the effect that geography, as explained in the PowerPoint, has on the story.
The seasons and their effects on literature. Seasons can have a major effect on the passage of time in literature. The use of seasons can portray the passage of time throughout literature, but specifically poetry. For example, using the season winter in poetry often represents the latter stages of a person's life, or that they are nearing death. In Shakespeare's Sonnet 73, he uses words compared to the end of his life, stating, "Where yellow leaves are none, where late the sweet birds sing." Also, this can be used as springtime representing early stages of life, summer as in the middle stages of life, young adulthood, or then autumn, which is like the adult life. Seasons also are used for emotion. They can be used any way the author wants you to feel and to try and get you to feel that way. For example, summer can often be used to portray passion and love. Even titles of different pieces of literature can be used to display seasons. For example, A Winter's Tale or The Twelfth Night represent winter as in sadness. For example, in C.S. Lewis' Lion, the Witch in the Wardrobe, he uses winter to represent hopelessness and despair under the White Witch. Often kind of coincidental, but religious examples also take place as Easter takes place in the springtime. It is a positive time for Christians as it represents a new hope after the resurrection of Jesus Christ. This applies to how springtime is used in literature to represent new beginnings and hope. Mythology explains change of seasons through stories relating to their gods like Hades and different gods they have. Okay, now for the assignment. I want you to, in your head, come up with a quick little haiku that uses seasons to either represent the passage of time or more emotional meaning. For example, mine is, "Springtime is now here, bringing along joy and hope, a new beginning." All right, that's it.
Marked for Greatness, Chapter 21. 4 centuries ago, when someone had an imperfection, it was viewed as being distant from God. The imperfections mentioned include a short leg, a scar, and scoliosis. Now they are seen as something that would separate someone from the average person. Oedipus blinded himself at the end of the play due to his guilt. Due to Oedipus's curse, he committed bad actions which led to his guilt. The guilt caused him to blind himself as he believed he deserved punishment. Oedipus's wounded feet show a personal story in his history about how he overcame being tied up and left to die. This shows how the story and the curse were inevitable. In stories, plays, etc., the imperfection is significant to the story. In the story, if you give a guy a limp in chapter 2, in chapter 24, he can't sprint after the train. You have to know he has a limp in order to know that he can't or why he can't chase after the train. Who is a character or person that is associated and known for their imperfection?
Okay. How to read literature like a professor. Chapter 22. He's blind for a reason, you know. Oh. Okay. So for this chapter, the author talks about the story Oedipus Rex, which is about a guy named Oedipus who, throughout the story, ends up killing his dad and marrying his mom. But at the time, he did not know who they really were. And once he figured out what he did, he blinds himself as punishment. So he'll never see the horrors of his actions ever again. So, the author of How to Read Literature Like a Professor, she proposes the idea that Oedipus was actually blind the whole time. Although he wasn't physically blind the entire time, at the beginning he was blind to the truth and to his reality. So she says that ignorance represents the blindness theme throughout the entire story. So her main tip of this chapter was to stop focusing on the literal sense of a story and start trying to figure out the figurative sense of a story. And authors purposefully write both figuratively and literally. And once you understand both points of view, it'll help you fully understand what you're reading, and it'll help you be able to analyze the story more. So she's basically just saying to read between the lines, and so you can fully, understand the story. Yeah, okay, that's it.
Chapter 23, It's Never Just Heart Disease. Heart problems in literature. In this chapter, the focus is heart illnesses, diseases, and its symbolism. Heart trouble is a very metaphorical subject, despite the situations it's brought up in being unrealistic. People often overlook it and just look at the meaning. The Iliad and the Odyssey. These are the examples that were mentioned in the chapter. Characters are described with a heart of iron, which means that they are tough-minded. Sophocles and a bunch of other writers, a bunch of other great writers use the heart to mean the center of emotion. In literature, heart symbolizes a lot of things in emotions. It's a deep and good thing, meaning that in writing, when a heart is brought up with illnesses and stuff, it's a really good factor to have because it emphasizes a lot. Even if reality, the heart has nothing to do with emotion, it has everything to do with emotion in literature. It represents suffering and describes characters if they're being lonely, cowardice, being loving too much or not enough. And the title of this chapter, It's Never Just Heart Disease, is true.
How to Read Literature Like a Professor, Chapter 24, and Rarely Just Illness. In James Joyce's The Sisters, he mentions the priest with no hope because he's had a stroke and is deteriorating. Our feelings towards this is different in real life and in our reading lives. Knowing someone who is dying and reading about it doesn't make you feel the same. Diseases in literature can be symbols or metaphors. Some works might not give the deeper meaning so easily. Diseases aren't telling us about physical condition, but how the character is suffering. 4 main principles for illness in literature. 1 is illness is not given equal treatment and some are favored. 2 is illnesses should be picturesque and physical changes are dramatic. 3 is they should be mysterious and dramatic so it's less predictable. 4 is that they are strong symbols or metaphors. Thinking deeply and openly with individual perspective. People can use their lives and past experiences to make assumptions in books, like with different diseases. We know how we can get sick, but other superstitions might make us think different. We are reading and understanding with our past knowledge and not an open mind. You could be reading and think it's just about a disease or its only meaning is what is said, but it can be a metaphor, a symbol for something else that you have to think deeper about. Everyone can understand differently from using their personal backgrounds. My chapter's goal is to make readers think deeper and openly about what they are reading and not use their lives to misunderstand. When you think deeper, you can learn more and have an open mind to learn about what's really going on. A disease isn't always just a disease or physical condition. Think of a time that you wish you were more open-minded and thought deeper about a concept or topic.
In Chapter 25, Foster explains that in order to be able to fully understand a piece of literature, you must be willing to read with an open mind as well as a viewpoint that is different from your current situation. When reading a book, you might find it pretty easy to judge the story based on the rules and morals that we apply day to day in 2019. However, Foster states that we, the reader, must be able to approach literature with an open mind and establish an emotional connection, sympathize with the character, or simply walk in their shoes. For example, the show Good Girls has these 3 women who are all facing financial crisis. One character is a stay-at-home mom who has 5 children, and her husband is cheating on her and using a lot of their money to pay for his mistress. And another character has a daughter who is very sick and has kidney disease, and the treatment is $10,000. It's very expensive. And the last character is having custody troubles or custody issues over her daughter and her ex-husband. So to try to make things better for themselves, they decide to rob a grocery store. So although these women may be bad and criminal, that's not the point. The point is that you're supposed to sympathize with these women and understand their story and understand their reasoning as to why they're doing what they do. Understand, that instead of seeing them as thieves or criminals, the author wants you to see them as women who are going through great lengths to provide for themselves and their family. But don't go too overboard. Foster states that although there's nothing wrong with establishing an emotional connection, readers must never be too accepting of the author's opinions and viewpoints. Or if by accepting their standpoint, your opinions and views also change. Because we all know that robbing stores, smuggling drugs, and killing people is wrong. But in order to understand the story, you must, to an extent, be able to sympathize with the character and their situation, or else you won't understand the story or its narrative. And lastly, what you should take away from this chapter is that to fully understand the passage, the reader must be able to cast aside their own perspective and read through the eyes of the character. So, for the end activity, try to think of a time where you didn't really understand a story because of your fixed viewpoint. And if you've never experienced that, try and give an example like I did above in the previous slide.